Captain House, a pirate, thief, murderer and a family man, always considered himself to be a man who valued other people's personal space. Not because of any benevolence, mind you, he simply believed that knowing something about someone was dangerously close to forming attachment, and being attached to anything or anyone in Persian sector was never a good idea. Friends, House thought, always eventually became enemies, and as for enemies, well, there was no reason to know anything about them too. After all, what was the point of learning anything about people you were just about to pirate to all hell? All this meant that House wasn't particularly happy when he was contacted by Zala and Dr. Disco, telling him they found out something very odd about their boss. He and his salvagers have just returned from unpleasantly hot and dusty surface of the planet, exhausted from scrapping whatever they could and bringing up that weird thing in the tank that Mr. Cart ordered them to recover. It stared at House from inside its tank all the way to the orbit, and though he would never admit it openly, he was too unnerved by it to stare right back. So, when they finally finished unloading all the stuff they salvaged on the surface, the only thing House wanted was to take a shower and wash away all the planetary dirt, but Zala and Disco sounded insistent, so he went to them, hidden away in Disco's medbay, to give them a piece of his mind. But then, they showed him the video from the surface. "Right," House said after watching it for the second time. "I was going to say that the feed is a bit fuzzy, but no amount of distortion can explain this." He pointed to the screen where Varuna was talking to a small round drone, the same kind Mr. Cart used to interact with the world outside his cabin. "Yeah, you can picture my surprise as well," Zala said. "No wonder Varuna never talks much about him. She's clearly in on this secret." "Secret, right." House sounded skeptical. "So what, our captain is a robot? Is it really that bad? I mean, I'm pretty much a robot myself with all the mechanical parts in me." He pointed to his face, split equally between metal and flesh. His life support clacked and whirred as he talked. "Well, you're only half robot, and the important part, the mind, is still human," Zala replied. "But what if we've been working for an actual, full-blown machine all this time?" "And you care about that, Zala?" House sounded confused. "I thought you don't give a damn about Lutz teaching, intelligent machines or not. He pays us on time and he generally tries to keep his crew alive and well. Couldn't give a damn if he's a toaster or not." "That's true, but what if—" the old pather started, but Dr. Disco interrupted. "Mr. Cart's personality and treatment of us as his employers may be just a ruse, designed to instill false sense of security," he said, staring intently at the screen. "What's more, we suspect that he may be the part of remnant AI. Consider the following. Until we started working for him, we only heard sporadic rumors about these machines, but ever since we joined this company we have encountered them, 2 or 3 times already? Most people don't even catch a glimpse of them within their entire lives. Additionally, every time we encountered them, they were not hostile towards us, despite their murderous reputation, which would fit if this Mr. Cart was part of their mainframe." "Maybe, sure. But did Herr Ludwig help us defuse that first encounter with his old Tritak employee codes? And wasn't the second group we met just a normal fleet using some fake transponder to deter visitors?" Yes, that is precisely what Mr. Cart said, and as this video feed clearly shows, he is not the most trustworthy person. Herr Ludwig, on the other hand, is part of the company that created intelligent AIs in the first place, and may simply be in on it. Why do you think Mr. Cart would give him command of the ship to a corp drone with 0 experience in space? And then there's this mysterious secret employer with tremendous amounts of resources and influence, capable of presenting us with fresh-made vessels, something that not even national navies are capable of doing too often. So in short, all of it looks like a part of a larger plan.
Alright, I'll bite. If there really is some sinister plan in place, what do you think it is?
We don't know, Captain. But the truth is that we may unwittingly be working for machines which, historically, from their very conception, were enemies of humanity. As a doctor, I'm supposed to protect human lives, and I'd rather not be a fool who's blindly guiding this entire fleet into enslavement by machine overlords.
Right, let's not go that far. If Mr. Cart wanted to turn us into organic batteries for the Remnant or other nonsense you spouted, Doc, he had plenty of chances to do so already,
Zala said, rolling her eyes. Disco clearly had a thing against AIs, which hinted at some history, but she decided to better not ask.
But still, I feel like our chief does have some agenda we don't understand, and now this video proves this even more. I know he's our captain, and we have no right to pry into his life, but, well, I don't think we can just blindly follow his command anymore, not until we understand at least a bit of what he wants. So it's either that or leaving the fleet as soon as we're back in the core.
House thought for a moment. Zala was right in one thing. There was something weird going on. Question was if it was a smart idea to investigate it, but at the same time, he didn't want to jump ship. Mr. Cart, for all his aloof loner weirdness, was a fair employer, and House's family lived comfortably thanks to that. So, reluctantly, he sighed and nodded along.
Very well, consider me on board. I'll go and scare some answers out of Ludwig.
He won't say anything. I tried probing him already, Dr. Disco said. I feel like the corpsman is either kept mostly in the dark by our boss, or he's conditioned to never say a word. Wouldn't surprise me, the way Tritac treats its employees. Lieutenant Europa won't say a word either, we all know that. I believe we may have to take this directly to Mr. Cart himself. Zala and House both looked at him with wide eyes.
And do what? Break into his cabin? If he really is a machine, that's probably a very bad idea.
But also the most sure one, if we want to understand the nature of our superior. I have noticed that every time something is happening, he always monitors situation through on-ship cameras. All we have to do is cause a distraction to keep him occupied, sneak in and take a look. Get in, get out, no fuss.
You forgot that the lock on his doors has top-quality encryption, Doc. We're gonna trip a dozen alarms if we want to hack it.
We won't. Not with this, Dr. Disco said with a smile, an uncommon sight for him, and fished something out of his pocket.
Is that Tritacian Universal Lock Opener 9000?
Zala's eyes glistened with childlike excitement.
That could probably open a wormhole to hyperspace right here and right now. How the hell did you get your hands on that? It costs tens of thousands.
Back when I was serving in medical response team on Syndria, we sometimes had to go through dozens of old underground buildings to reach our platinum clients. Or, more often, we had to break through buildings infested with insurgents and gangs. We really didn't have time to fiddle with logs back then, so our bosses outfitted us with these skeleton keys. I may have taken it when I left my old job. House just nodded with approval, while Zala gave Disco a knowing look.
So, you're a Syndrian, eh? Now I finally understand why you're so rigid all the time. But yeah, with this toy we're pretty much golden on opening any door. Now we just have to cause a distraction.
I think that problem will take care of itself, House said, and pointed to another screen, one which showed the cargo hold. The same cargo hold where the weird tank, and its even weirder occupant, from the surface were. On the screen, Brother Jesselton walked into the hold, took one look at this bizarre organic amalgamation, and started to scream.
"What the hell kind of heresy is this?"
he shouted, backing away from the tank, his hands gesturing a ludic symbol to ward off evil.
"Why in Lord's name someone brought this ungodly machine on board? Is it not enough for these maniacs from the Academy to play God? Now we're going to try too?"
The commotion he made attracted few other crewmates, and few minutes later, the cargo hold was full of people. The devout Luddites, with Jesselton at the helm, bursted with outrage and demanded that the unholy machine and the demon inside it had to be destroyed and remains thrown out of the airlock. The more profit-oriented crewmates formed a cordon around the tank and demanded for the preacher to back off, since this machinery was no doubt worth a ton of credits. And, of course, a third group gathered at the outskirts and made bets on which side would win. 1 more minute and tools were being waved in the air, and at least one gun was pointed at the Luddites, who were not intimidated in the slightest, getting more and more infuriated and filled with their righteous fervor. According to Zala, within the next minute someone would be on the ground, bleeding, but before that could happen, a new person arrived in the cargo hold.
Oi, fuckstains, do I have to beat some sense into each and every one of you?
Varuna shouted, entering the room still in her full combat armor.
Everyone shut the fuck up and get back to work. I'm locking this place down.
You can lock it down as soon as this affront to all creation is thrown out of the airlock into the sun, Lieutenant, Jesselton said, and his fellow religious crewmates cheered. Huh, he's talking about himself, Chief, one of the engineers guarding the tank shouted. Give us 1 hot second to throw him and his Stone Age hippies out of here, and we can all get back to business.
Nothing and no one will be thrown anywhere, Varuna said coldly. Jesselton, stop riling up your flock, or whatever the hell you call them. Engineer Duncan, quit antagonizing Luddites at every opportunity. Now, either everyone will get back to their stations right now, or I will start cracking skulls.
There's around 40 people in that room, Zala said, staring at the screen, and yet I still think she'd walk out of there without a scratch. No doubt, Dr. Disco said. I did her medical checkup. With that armor on, she's like a tank. But we have our distraction right there, so let us use it. The 3 of them rushed out of the medbay and, moments later, arrived in front of doors to Mr. Cart's personal quarters. House looked at Zala and shook his head, but it was too late for second-guessing. Dr. Disco slid his electronic lockpick into the console and it sparked. Seconds later, the door slid open without making a sound, but the doctor wasn't too happy about it. What the hell is that encryption? It fried my key, he complained, but Zala put her hand over his face. Now really wasn't the time for talking. Instead, all 3 of them quietly snuck into darkness beyond the door, although, in case of House, his silence was broken every few seconds by his artificial lungs. The first thing they noticed was yet another door, the kind they, as spacers, immediately recognized.
Is that an airlock? Zala said, scratching her head. Why the hell would he have an airlock going into his quarters?
Well, if he is a machine, he may not need air to breathe, Dr. Disco said, paranoia glistening in his eyes.
But we saw Varuna coming and going out of there without spacesuit.
Yes, but it is also possible that she doesn't need air as well, or has a built-in rebreather. Only her Tritakian creators know what they put into her.
Right, well, guess we're about to find out, House said, shaking his head and cycling the airlock. One question, though. What are we going to do when we actually meet our esteemed captain?
If he is indeed a machine, we'll have to eliminate him for the good of all mankind, Disco said with determination, but Zala put her hand on his shoulder.
We will not be eliminating anyone, Doc. Even if our boss is a sentient toaster, he's been good to us and gave us no reason to harm him. But I suppose we will have to ask him to explain himself. Ah, now shut up!
She said that because the airlock finished cycling, and second set of doors opened, revealing inside of Mr. Cart's quarters. The occupant, however, was nowhere to be seen, so the 3 intruders slowly walked in, trying to make as little noise as possible.
This place is barren, House said, looking around. And I'd know. I flew with some extremely poor captains.
He was right. They all had expectations on how this room would look, but no one expected, well, almost nothing. There were a bunch of screens showing readings from all over the fleet, but the only thing that signified this place was inhabited was a few old empty beer bottles stuck in the corner. Aside from that, almost everything else was cold, efficient machinery, one necessary for operating a spaceship, but without any personal touches or quirks that every spacer was bound to develop sooner or later. But there were few things that caught everyone's attention. First and foremost, there was almost no gravity there, especially compared with the rest of the fleet. And also, the holoscreens were all arranged in a circle, and in the middle of it a bizarre harness hung from the ceiling. Pipes and cables sneaked down around it, as if they were supposed to connect to something in the middle. Zala exhaled through her nose.
I swear, if we went through all of this just to find some freaky BDSM setup,
she started, but Disco pointed to something on the wall. A helmet was hanging there, the same one they've seen on their screens so many times, one belonging to their boss. They all turned to it as if expecting it would spring to life on its own, and in that moment, a hidden pair of doors opened behind them with a silent hiss. Surprised, they turned around again and saw something. To call this creature a man would perhaps be a bit too generous, but it certainly was humanoid, a very round humanoid indeed. Its big head, covered in scattered patches of hair, was connected to a malformed body with barely any neck. In the center of the face, above flattened nose and inhumanly wide mouth, was a pair of small, round eyes, sunken deep into the skull and set way too far apart. The creature stared at the intruders with these weird eyes with confusion. Below, the body was a bizarre, tangled mess of cables and pipes, interlocked with flesh and bone. Multiple cables snaked down its back, disappearing somewhere within its bulbous body, and though this creature was, as mentioned, round, it was difficult to tell if it was caused by fat or simply by its unnatural build. What's worse, the three intruders realized that the being before them was glistening with something wet. But none of that was the weirdest part. Not the odd eyes, not the lack of neck or bizarre amalgamation of meat and machine that was below it. The weirdest part was lower, for where the waist of this creature should be, the meat ended completely, replaced by a large, wheeled machine, a machine that looked very much like a cart, Zala managed to say.
I mean, Mr. Katz? Hello? Sorry for intruding?
The being that was Mr. Cart looked at them with its small, whiteless eyes, which were set so far apart he had to move his head like a dog to see them with both eyes at once. He had to crane his almost non-existent neck quite high, as he was much shorter than everyone else. Then, when he finally realized what he was looking at, he reached to the side of his wheeled lower body and pulled out a piece of fabric, a towel, with which he started wiping water that covered him.
"Hello to you too, Zala,"
he said, weakly, without breaking eye contact. The old pather was starting to sweat.
"Would you mind handing me my helmet? My breathing is not that great without it."
She did what her boss asked and picked up the helmet, and, with some degree of horror, realized that it also had cables on the inside. Pipes that, she realized later, probably connected all the way to Mr. Cart's lungs. She handed it to him and he grabbed it clumsily with his short fingers. He then spent a good minute putting it on, grunting and panting like he was running a marathon. Zala looked at House, but he seemed unfazed by this situation, though, then again, it was difficult to say for sure when it comes to a man whose face is half made of metal. Dr. Disco, on the other hand, stared at Mr. Cart with a mix of shock and fascination. Clearly, he was expecting to find something much different here.
"Right, thanks, Zala,"
Mr. Cart said after his helmet was back on his head. His visor was glowing red, flooding the room with ominous light.
"I swear I decided to take my first shower in years to wash off the dust of that damn planet, and this happens."
For a moment, everyone was quiet until, finally, House took a step forward and extended his hand.
"Sorry for that, Captain, but I guess you knew how curious people were about you."
Mr. Cart looked at the extended hand like it was a hand grenade, but after a second of hesitation shook it with his meaty fingers. "Oh yes, I do. Almost no rules in this bloody fleet, no prying into personal lives of the crewmates, and yet here you are, in my cabin, violating the one boundary I set. But never mind that. Zala, could you be a dear and press that green button on the wall? Thank you. Now, if you just count to 10... He reached 8 when the doors burst open and Varuna charged in, still in her power armor and with a blank look on her face. 2 more seconds, and House, Zala and Disco lied flat on the floor as Lieutenant towered above them, knife in each hand.
"Well, I fucked up security detail here, boss,"
she said, her face back to normal.
"Do I toss them out of the airlock?"
Zala tried to say something, but received a swift kick to the ribs as soon as she opened her mouth. She cursed and curled into a ball, watching as Mr. Cart spent another few minutes trying to put on his suit. Once he was done, he rolled towards them. "Guess we'll see, Lieutenant. Tell me, lads, do we have to toss you out the airlock?"
"If you mean if we'll stay quiet about how you look, then you can count on it, Captain," House said. "I mean, I don't see what's the deal here, to be honest. There are worse-looking people out there. Hell, some of them are in this fleet."
"It's not just about his looks, pirate," Disco said. "He is an anomaly. I thought he was malformed at first, but now I think he looks like that for a reason. And those implants, I don't recognize most of them, but they're clearly way more complex than the usual stuff."
"Hold on a sec." Zala's remaining eye glistened with realization. "Does that mean that you're like Varuna? I mean, not exactly like her, but you know. So that's why you both try to avoid Tritachyon all the time?"
"I hope you don't expect me to answer that," Mr. Cart said. "Who I am is my business. But now, very unfortunately, it is also your business. So tell me, how can I be sure you'll never mention it? How can I know that you can't be bought if Tritak offers you a load of escrows for me?"
Varuna raised her knives menacingly and said, "I know an easy and simple way to keep them quiet. Come on, Chief, do we strike you as the type who would take corporate cash and sell out our co-workers?" Zala said from the floor. "They'd probably kill us after they got their info."
"Which would still leave them with information I really don't want them to have. And while I may trust you a bit, Zala, how can I be sure about House or Dr. Disco? Our dear captain here is a family man, which makes him easy to threaten. And as for the doctor, well, I don't know him enough to form an opinion, so I'd rather be safe than sorry."
"Airlock it is, then,"
Varuna said, and effortlessly lifted both Disco and House off the ground. They tried to resist, but it was pointless. "Unless," Mr. Cart continued, and she lowered them back to the floor, "unless you give me something to ensure your silence. House, you're easy. Tell me where your family lives, and their names, and you're free to go. Zala, I'd like to know why, despite the fact you left the path, a lot of the followers still respect you. And Doctor, I'd absolutely love to hear why someone who walks and talks like a Syndrian officer is in my fleet, pretending to be a surgeon." They all looked at each other, except Varuna, who stared at the airlock with a grim smile, and, after a while, all nodded together.
"Fine, Captain,"
House said, and extended his hand again. This time the handshake was a bit more firm.
"If that's what you want, then so be it. Just know that I will not allow you to spread this information anywhere."
"Don't make me do it, then," he replied. "Shall we have a talk, then?"
"Sure, but one thing. Disco mounted a camera on your shuttle. That is why we decided to sneak here in the first place. Because in the feed from that camera it looked like you were not down there, just your drone. What's the deal with that?"
I suppose I can tell you that. There's a fun little software built into my suit. Projects a false image to every surveillance device in the area. Just a little something to keep me from being spotted by a random drone or a security camera. Expensive, high-tech stuff, but worth it. Also, Doctor, later I'd also love to hear why you have spy cams on you." Disco smiled nervously and scratched his head. There was no worming his way out of this one.
"Alright, but what really bothers me is that thing."
Zala pointed to the cables and pipes hanging from the ceiling.
"What's the deal with the free crack?"
"That, Zala, refills all my implants with all the liquids they need. Which is also why I am so interested in earning as many credits as possible, because this shit is expensive. Also, it does this." He rolled to the center of the room and pressed the button on the harness. All the pipes immediately attached themselves to his suit, and the room brightened as dozens of holo screens appeared all around. "It connects me to the ships themselves. All of them, in the entire fleet." The crew stared at this glistening display, the image of which was slightly diminished by Mr. Cart's malformed body in the center, but it was still something they've never seen before. "I told you I live for flying," their boss said, and disconnected himself from the ships. "Now then, we're going to have an enlightening talk, won't we?" And indeed it was a fascinating conversation, for Mr. Cat at least. Few hours later, when the three intruders left the room, Mr. Cat knew quite a lot of new things about them. Things that, he hoped, were enough to keep them silent. But while Zala and House left his quarters relieved that they were still alive, Dr. Disco seemed to be focused on something else. He kept muttering to himself, and Zala finally decided to ask about it.
Oi, Doc, you've been whispering to yourself almost all the time we were inside there. You doing okay?
759. What? Ah, yes, of course, I'm just repeating the tattoo. Zala just gave him a confused look in response. He had a small tattoo on the side of his head, a long string of letters and numbers, like a serial number. I have to remember it. Maybe I can figure out where he came from.
I don't think this is a good idea, Doc,
Zala said, but Disco wasn't listening. He rushed past her and locked himself back in the medbay, ignoring Luddigs and engineers that were pacified by Varuna earlier. Turns out, Mr. Cat was not a machine, but he still was a mystery, and Dr. Disco absolutely, passionately hated mysteries. Fortunately, they were about to return to the main source of knowledge in the sector, and what better place to look for answer than the famed Galatian Academy?